I crashed my car, and now my girlfriend won't let me out of the house. Hey Reddit, I'm Jake, 28, and I'm in a tough spot. A couple of months ago, I got into a pretty bad car accident, lost control on a wet road, and before I knew it, I had crashed into a guardrail. I came out with a concussion and some bruises, but no life-threatening injuries. The real problem started after the accident. My girlfriend, Emily, 27, has become extremely overprotective, borderline paranoid, even. She won't let me drive anywhere, barely wants me to leave the house, and checks up on me constantly whenever I go out. I understand she's scared after what happened, but it's becoming overwhelming. I feel like I'm trapped, and I don't know how to help her or how to fix this. Here's the story of how my car accident turned our relationship upside down and how I'm trying to regain some sense of normalcy in my life. It was just an ordinary Tuesday morning, or at least, that's how it started. I remember rushing out of the apartment because I was running late for a work meeting. I work as a sales rep for a tech company, so I'm always driving around, meeting with clients. I had done the same drive 100 times before, nothing unusual. The sky was dark with rain clouds, and it had been pouring all night. The roads were slick, the kind of wet where even if you're going the speed limit, you can feel the tires lose a little bit of traction here and there. I should have known to take it easy, but I was in a hurry. I had a client waiting for me, and the last thing I wanted was to show up late. Everything felt normal until I hit the on-ramp to the highway. That's when it happened. I hit a patch of water, and my tires suddenly lost all grip on the road. The car fishtailed, and in a split second, I knew I was in trouble. The steering wheel jerked out of my hands as I desperately tried to regain control. But it was too late. The car spun out, the world outside the windows blurring as I lost control. I remember the helpless feeling as the car skidded toward the guardrail. There was a brief moment where everything seemed to slow down, like I was watching it happen from outside my own body. And then, crash. The impact was jarring. The sound of metal crumpling against metal was deafening. The front of the car slammed into the guardrail, the airbags exploded out in front of me, and my body was thrown forward against the seatbelt before being snapped back. I hit my head against the side window, hard. My vision blurred, and for a moment, everything went black. When I came to, my ears were ringing, my body felt like it had been through a blender, and the smell of smoke and burning rubber filled the car. My chest hurt from where the seatbelt had dug into my skin, and my neck was stiff from the impact. My hands were shaking as I fumbled to grab my phone. The car was destroyed. The hood was crumpled like a piece of paper, and the front bumper had practically disintegrated on impact. I sat there, dazed, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The rain was still coming down, pattering on the shattered windshield. I looked down at my phone and dialed Emily's number. My hands were trembling so badly that I could barely hit the buttons. Calling Emily. When Emily answered, her voice was cheerful at first, like she had no idea what was coming. "Hey, babe. What's up?" I struggled to speak, my voice shaky. "Emily. I crashed the car." The silence on the other end was immediate. I could almost hear her breath catch, and when she finally spoke, her voice was filled with panic. "Oh my God, Jake, are you okay? Where are you? Are you hurt?" "I think I'm okay," I said, my head spinning. "The car's totaled, though." "Are you bleeding? Did you hit your head?" she demanded, her voice rising with worry. I could hear her moving around, probably grabbing her keys, already on her way out the door. I tried to reassure her, but I could tell she wasn't listening. "I'm coming to get you," she said firmly. "Stay where you are." "No, Em, it's fine. I'm coming." She hung up before I could argue, leaving me sitting in the wrecked car, staring at the rain-soaked road ahead. My head was pounding, and my body ached, but I figured I'd be fine. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Accidents happen, right? But I didn't know it yet, this wasn't just going to be about the car. This accident would set off a chain reaction that I never saw coming. By the time Emily arrived, the paramedics had already checked me out. They told me I had a mild concussion and some bruises from the seatbelt, but nothing major. I was lucky, they said. It could have been a lot worse, one of them told me as he packed up his kit. But when Emily pulled up, I saw the look on her face. It was like the color had drained from her skin. Her usual calm, collected demeanor was gone, replaced by sheer panic. She rushed over to me, her hands shaking as she grabbed my shoulders. "Are you okay? Are you sure? What did the paramedics say?" She fired off questions faster than I could answer them. "I'm fine, Em," I said, trying to calm her down. "Just a mild concussion and some bruises. Nothing serious." But she wasn't convinced. Her eyes scanned me, looking for any signs of injury that I might have missed. Her hands hovered over me like she was afraid to touch me, like I might break if she did. "I thought I was going to lose you," she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't know what to say. I hadn't realized just how deeply this had affected her. I knew she'd be worried, but the fear in her eyes was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. At the time, I thought it was just the shock of the accident. I figured once we got home and had some time to process, things would go back to normal. But I was wrong. The first few days after the accident were tough. My body was sore, my head was pounding, and I was exhausted from the emotional drain of everything that had happened. Emily was by my side constantly, hovering over me like a protective shield. At first, I thought it was sweet. She made sure I rested, brought me food, and checked on me every hour to make sure I wasn't feeling dizzy or in pain. It felt like she was genuinely worried about me, and I appreciated it. But as the days turned into weeks, Emily's concern started to feel less like caring and more like smothering. It started with the driving. My car was totaled, so I had to get a rental while I figured out what to do next. When I mentioned that I was going to pick up the rental, Emily's face paled. "You're not going to drive again already, are you?" she asked, her voice full of concern. I raised an eyebrow. "I mean, I have to. I can't just sit at home forever." Her expression shifted, her eyes widening with fear. "But what if something happens again? You're still recovering. You shouldn't be driving so soon." "Em, I'm fine. The accident was just a freak thing. I'll be more careful from now on." But she wasn't convinced. "I'll drive you," she insisted. "You shouldn't be behind the wheel yet." I sighed, figuring it would be easier to just let her drive me than argue about it. But that was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Emily's anxiety seemed to grow with each passing day. It wasn't just about driving anymore, it was about everything. Every time I left the house, whether it was to go to work, the grocery store, or even just out for a run, Emily would bombard me with questions. "Are you sure you feel okay? Are you dizzy? Do you think you should rest instead? What if you get hurt again?" I tried to reassure her, but no matter what I said, it didn't seem to make a difference. She was always worried, always afraid that something terrible was going to happen. It got to the point where she'd ask me to text her as soon as I got to my destination, just to let her know I was okay. And if I didn't, she'd start calling me, frantic with worry. There was one morning where I was getting ready to meet up with some friends for lunch. I hadn't seen them in a while, and I was looking forward to catching up. I grabbed my jacket, ready to head out the door, when Emily stopped me. "Jake, do you really need to go out today?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "You've been out a lot lately. Maybe you should just stay home and rest." I looked at her, confused. "What do you mean? I haven't been out in days. I'm fine." She bit her lip, her eyes darting to the floor. I worry about you. What if something happens? What if you're not fully recovered yet?" I felt a surge of frustration but tried to keep my voice calm. "Em, I can't stay inside forever. I need to get back to my life." She didn't say anything for a long moment, just looked at me with those wide, worried eyes. "Promise me you'll be careful," she finally whispered. I will, I said, leaning down to kiss her forehead before heading out the door. But even as I left, I could feel her watching me, her anxiety practically radiating from her. And sure enough, by the time I reached the restaurant, my phone buzzed with a text from Emily. "Are you okay? Did you get there safely?" I stared at the message, my heart sinking. I wanted to be understanding. I knew the accident had shaken her up, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being suffocated. It was like she didn't trust me to take care of myself anymore. A few weeks later, when I mentioned that I had to drive out of town for a work trip, Emily's reaction caught me off guard. I could see the fear in her eyes as soon as I brought it up. "You're not driving that far, are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if the roads are bad? What if you crash again?" I sighed, trying to reassure her. It's just a 2-hour drive. I'll be fine. I'm more careful now, I don't speed, and I always check the road conditions." But she shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. I can't lose you, Jake. What if something happens? I don't know what I'd do." Her voice cracked, and she turned away, wiping her eyes. I felt a pang of guilt. I didn't want to make her feel like this, but I also didn't want to live in a bubble. I couldn't keep turning down work trips and canceling plans just to avoid making her anxious. "Emily, I'm not going anywhere," I said softly, reaching for her hand. "I'll be careful. I promise." She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. I hated seeing her like this, constantly worried, always on edge, but I didn't know how to fix it. How do you convince someone that the world isn't as dangerous as they think it is? Arguments and frustration. As Emily's anxiety worsened, the tension between us grew. I understood why she was scared, but it felt like she was projecting all of her fear onto me, and I didn't know how to deal with it. There was one Saturday where I had plans to go hiking with some friends. It was something I hadn't done in months, and I was really looking forward to getting outside and clearing my head. But when I told Emily about it, she was immediately against the idea. "You can't go hiking," she said, her voice full of panic. "What if you get hurt? What if you fall? You're not ready for something like that." I stared at her, stunned. "Emily, it's just a hike. I've done this trail a dozen times before. I'll be fine." But she wasn't convinced. "It's too dangerous. You've barely recovered from the accident, and now you're going to go off into the woods? What if you're alone and something happens?" Her voice was rising with every word, and I could see the fear in her eyes. But I wasn't backing down this time. I can't live my life like this. I need to get out. I need to do things." "I'm just trying to protect you," she snapped, her voice breaking. "I don't need protecting." I shouted, my frustration boiling over. "I'm fine. The accident was a freak thing, and I've been careful ever since. You're treating me like I'm going to fall apart at any moment." Emily flinched, her eyes filling with tears again. "I'm scared, Jake. I'm scared of losing you. You don't understand what it was like getting that call, seeing you hurt. I can't go through that again." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to be angry at her, but I couldn't. I could see how much the accident had affected her, how deeply it had shaken her sense of safety. But at the same time, I couldn't live my life in fear of what might happen. "I get that you're scared," I said softly, my voice trembling. "But you can't keep me locked up in this house. I need to live my life, and you need to trust me that I'll be okay." She didn't say anything, just looked at me with those wide, tear-filled eyes. Finally, she nodded, but I knew it wasn't a real agreement. It was just her way of ending the argument. The breaking point came a few weeks later. I had been out with some friends one night, just a casual night at a local bar to unwind and catch up. I had texted Emily a few times throughout the night, letting her know I was okay, but when I got home, I found her sitting on the couch, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. "What's wrong?" I asked, dropping my keys on the table as I walked over to her. She looked up at me, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't stop thinking about you driving home. I kept picturing you getting into another accident. I thought, what if something happens? What if he doesn't make it home this time?" I knelt down in front of her, gently taking her hands in mine. "Emily, I'm fine. I'm always careful now. You don't have to worry." But she shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I can't help it, Jake. Ever since the accident, I can't stop thinking about losing you. It's like this constant fear in the back of my mind, and I don't know how to make it go away." Hearing her say those words broke my heart. I had known she was struggling, but I hadn't realized just how bad it had gotten. "We need to get you some help," I said softly, brushing a tear from her cheek. "This isn't normal, Em. You shouldn't have to live in fear like this." She sniffled, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I know. I don't know why I'm like this. I don't know how to make it stop." I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly as she cried against my chest. "We'll figure this out together," I whispered. "I'm not going anywhere. But you need help." The next week, Emily agreed to see a therapist. It wasn't easy for her. Emily's always been the type of person who prides herself on being strong and independent, so admitting that she needed help was a huge step for her. I went with her to the first appointment. Her therapist, Dr. Bennett, was a calm, middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a gentle voice. She listened carefully as Emily talked about the accident, about how her anxiety had spiraled out of control since then, and how it was affecting her daily life. As Emily talked, I could see the weight of everything she had been carrying. She spoke about how terrified she had been when she got that call from me after the accident, how she had feared the worst, how every time I left the house, she worried that something terrible would happen. It was like her mind was stuck in this loop, constantly replaying the what-ifs. Dr. Bennett nodded sympathetically. "It sounds like you're dealing with some post-traumatic stress," she said gently. "What you're experiencing is very common after a traumatic event. Your brain is wired to protect you from danger, so when you think about Jake being in a similar situation, it triggers that fear response." Emily nodded, wiping her eyes. "I just don't know how to stop it. I feel like I can't control it." Dr. Bennett smiled warmly. "That's what we're going to work on together. There are techniques we can use to help you manage your anxiety and retrain your brain to recognize that just because something bad happened once, it doesn't mean it will happen again." I sat beside Emily, holding her hand, feeling a mixture of relief and guilt. I was relieved that she was finally getting help, but I felt guilty for not realizing how deeply the accident had affected her until now. Over the next few weeks, Emily continued to see Dr. Bennett regularly. The therapy sessions were hard for her at first. She wasn't used to talking about her feelings, especially not with a stranger. But slowly, she started to make progress. Dr. Bennett introduced Emily to different techniques for managing her anxiety. They started with deep breathing exercises and mindfulness practices, which helped Emily calm her racing thoughts when she felt overwhelmed. Then they moved on to cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, where Emily learned how to challenge the catastrophic thoughts that were fueling her anxiety. For example, when she started thinking, "What if Jake crashes his car again? What if something terrible happens?" Dr. Bennett taught her to ask herself, "What evidence do I have that this will happen? What are the actual chances of this occurring?" It wasn't an easy process, but it helped her realize that her fears, while real to her, weren't always grounded in reality. I noticed small changes in Emily over time. She started letting me go out without texting me every 5 minutes to check if I was okay. She didn't flinch every time I mentioned driving or making plans with friends. She was still protective, but the suffocating fear that had consumed her before was starting to fade. We even started going out together again: dinners, hikes, weekend trips. It was like we were rediscovering our relationship, piece by piece, as Emily regained control over her anxiety. As Emily made progress in therapy, I started to feel like I was regaining my freedom. I no longer felt like I was walking on eggshells around her, constantly worried about triggering her anxiety. I could go out with friends, drive to work, and take trips without feeling like I was causing her a panic attack. There was one moment that stands out in my mind. I had a work trip coming up, a 2-hour drive to meet with a client in another city. A few months ago, this would have sent Emily into a tailspin of anxiety, but when I mentioned it to her this time, she surprised me. "I think you should go," she said, her voice calm. "I'll be okay." I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Are you sure? I don't want you to feel like I'm abandoning you." She smiled softly. "I'll be fine. I've been working on this with Dr. Bennett. I know it's going to make me anxious, but I can handle it." It was a small victory, but it felt huge. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. I could live my life without constantly worrying about how it would affect Emily. The trip went smoothly. I texted Emily a few times to check in, and while I could tell she was still nervous, she didn't panic. When I got home, she greeted me with a hug, relief evident in her eyes, but there was no trace of the overwhelming fear that had gripped her before. As Emily's anxiety lessened, our relationship started to heal. The tension that had been hanging over us for months began to fade, and we were able to reconnect in a way we hadn't in a long time. We started going out together, more dinners, hikes, weekend trips. Things that had once been a source of stress for Emily were now things we could enjoy again. It was like a weight had been lifted off both of our shoulders. There was one weekend that stands out to me in particular. We decided to take a trip to a cabin in the mountains, a place we had visited a few years ago when we first started dating. It was a special place for us, full of good memories, and I hoped it would help us rebuild what we had lost. The drive up to the cabin was beautiful, the sun was shining, the trees were turning shades of orange and red, and the mountains loomed in the distance, majestic and peaceful. I glanced over at Emily a few times during the drive, half expecting to see her tense or worried, but she was calm, staring out the window with a small smile on her face. When we arrived at the cabin, it felt like we had stepped back in time. We spent the weekend hiking, cooking together, and sitting by the fire, just talking, really talking, like we hadn't done in months. It was the first time in a long time that I felt like we were truly connected again. We reminisced about our early days together, the awkward first dates, the late-night drives, the trips we took before life got so complicated. It was like we were rediscovering who we were as a couple, and it felt good. It felt right. By the time we left the cabin, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in months. We weren't completely back to where we had been before the accident, something like that changes you, but we were stronger, more resilient, and more in tune with each other than ever before. As the months went on, Emily continued to make progress, and our relationship continued to strengthen. We weren't the same people we had been before the accident, something like that changes you, but we had learned how to adapt, how to support each other through the tough times. Emily wasn't completely free of her anxiety, but she had learned how to manage it in a way that didn't consume her life. She was no longer terrified every time I left the house. She trusted me to take care of myself, and she trusted herself to handle her fears. And as for me, I learned how to be more patient, more understanding of her struggles. The accident had been a wake-up call for both of us, a reminder that life is unpredictable, that you can't control everything, and that sometimes, you need to lean on the people you love to get through the tough times. We had been through hell and back, but we had come out stronger on the other side. Now, looking back on everything we went through, I can see how the accident changed our relationship, both for better and for worse. It exposed vulnerabilities we didn't know we had, but it also forced us to confront those issues and grow from them. Emily still worries about me sometimes. She still asks me to be careful when I drive, and she still texts me when I'm out for too long. But it's different now. It's not the all-consuming fear that it once was, it's just her way of showing that she cares. And as for me, I've learned to be more mindful of how my actions affect her. I've learned to be more communicative, more supportive, and more aware of the things that trigger her anxiety. We're not perfect. No relationship is. But we've learned that we can face challenges together, and that's what matters. Thanks for listening, Reddit. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that love isn't always easy, but it's worth fighting for.